My name is Chan Hellman, and I'm a professor in one of the Norman-based programs, Department of Human Relations. I'm also the Associate Dean for the College of Arts and Sciences, and then I have adjunct appointments in internal medicine, pediatrics, and in public health. So most of that is just for research kinds of activities. My training, just as you know, is I'm a quantitative psychologist, meaning I went to school to learn and study statistics, and in particular my area of specialty was measurement, and my dissertation was the development of a scale. So this topic is something I'm kind of interested in. It's intended to be introductory, though. There's no prerequisite or anything. And so today, tomorrow, and Friday, while each of those will stand alone, each of those could stand alone, they also will build upon each other. And so we have some people coming in. So today, we're going to do introductory concepts in measurement, in particular validity and reliability, and just the terms and the language. But I'll tell you that my objective for these 3 sessions is to be skill-based. It's not to be necessarily grounded in the philosophy of science or, talk about the pros and cons of the different theories of measurement. It's meant for you to walk away from this session being able to understand what we mean by those validity and reliability, and to have some experience on how to analyze that data with your own data, so to speak. And so, yeah, please, we have food. So again, I do intend this to be skill oriented, not just lecture and philosophical. But today will be more philosophical and lecture, just because I want to get that baseline language going. Okay, so I think tomorrow is really evaluating measures. So how to find measures and to evaluate them for psychometric properties. And then Friday is going to be more analyzing your own data. And it does not require any prerequisite in statistical analysis. All of these are introductory types. Before I get started, I do want to thank Shelley Fowler, who coordinated this session, and the Vice President or Assistant Vice President of Research's office, and College of Arts and Sciences, who I believe funded the food. So thanks to those folks and those organizations. So what we know about, and I'll get into the measurement piece, but what we are striving towards is that research is the application of the scientific method with the purpose of discovery. Right? So it's this application, this attempt to minimize or reduce bias in our methods, right? And so research itself, its primary goal is the discovery of truth, right? So from a science standpoint, that is our goal. So stigma, for instance, what we want to know is trying to capture and measure truth, right? Now, if the idea for research is that our goal and our purpose is the discovery of truth, the idea that without measurement, it cannot be studied, right? We have to have measurements in order to study or to apply the scientific method. So from that framework, measurement is the heart and soul of science, okay? Does that make sense? So measurement is a fundamental aspect of science. If you can't measure it, you can't study it. Right? The other aspect about this scientific process is that we have this basic assumption that we are measuring our topic, our area of interest, without error, right? The assumptions in statistics, for instance, is that the correlation coefficient, the basic assumption is that we have measured something without error. Now, when we talk about reliability and validity, what we're going to be focused on in here are more aligned with those psychological, or we're looking at attitudes, perceptions, or behaviors, for instance. And so It might be, for instance, individual ratings of an observation as well. This is not a topic, for instance, if we're looking at cellular biology, for instance. A lot of the topics that I'm going to be focused in on aren't necessarily applicable, because what we're really going to be focused on are those things that are not directly observable. That is what we call constructs, right? Which are abstract ideas of things that cannot be directly measured. Right? So my area of interest, the thing that I'm interested in the most, is the concept of hope, right? And in particular, what I'm interested in is people living in poverty and extreme adversity. What does hope look like, and how does hope help individuals progress to a capacity to thrive or to live a fulfilled life? And so this idea of hope is not something that you can directly observe. It's an abstraction, right? Another example would be love or hate or stigma. These are all constructs in our mind. And so validity and reliability become increasingly important to assess, right? So there are many different theoretical frameworks within measure. So what I'm going to focus on is the classical test theory. And when we talk about classical test theory, that is, for instance, if I ask you overall, how satisfied are you with your job? And I give you a rating from 1 to 5, not at all to a strong amount, right? Likert type response format, that the way in which you mark that answer, and again, the purpose of research is the discovery of truth, you're going to make a mark on that response, and we're going to assume that that is truth, right? That reflects truth. But what we know is that every time you put pen to paper or take a web-based survey, there's going to be some amount of truth and some amount of error in that, right? And so what we're going to be focused on is this aspect of that. And I want to highlight the difficulty of this process by a couple of things. First of all, if I ask you overall, how satisfied are you with your job, and this morning you got passed over for a promotion, does that influence the way you respond to the survey in the afternoon, right? So that there are things that can influence this perspective of truth, right? Another aspect of that is our difficulty in understanding the meaning associated with these constructs. So, for instance, when I say the word job satisfaction, right, we all know what that means, right?
Yes.
Yes? Right? So I can ask you, how satisfied are you with your job? And you know what I'm asking about, right? So let's think about that for a second. When I say job satisfaction, what comes to mind? What things are important when you think about job satisfaction?
Different perspectives, definitely. There are different perspectives. Depends on each person's object or aim from that job.
But if I ask the word overall, how satisfied are you with your job, I'm trying to get at truth. Mm-hmm. Right? So how many of you, when you think of job satisfaction, are thinking the job itself? Right? How many of you are thinking pay and benefits? Right? I'm a faculty member, and I can tell you probably one of the more important components of my job satisfaction is autonomy. I really want to be left alone so I can do my work. I don't want to be interfered with committee meetings and administrators and things like that, right? So the idea, though, is if you are thinking about pay and benefits, but I'm thinking about the job itself, those are two different pieces of information. But we're going to use the word job satisfaction, right? And but we actually mean two different things, right? So this process of measurement is very difficult. Okay. Now, I have been married for 32 years, and I'm going to ask you to stop recording. Just kidding. My wife knows I use this as an example. I've been married for 32 years. I married above my station, which is the first thing I want to say, which is should be all of our goals, right, is to marry above our state. My wife is so much better than I am, that kind of thing. Now, I'm also a psychologist by training, and I love to dream. I think dreaming is just the essence of psychology, and I love it. Now, in the moment, if I have a scary dream, I may not like it, but at the end of the day, it's like, isn't that amazing that we have this capacity to sleep and to go through a script in our mind? That, to me, is just mind-blowing, and I love to dream, right? Now, my wife and I also have a ritual. So if you ask me, I've been married for 32 years, if you ask me, overall, how satisfied are you with your marriage, right? By and large, I'm going to say satisfied or very satisfied, right? But I also love to dream. And there are sometimes, my wife and I have this ritual. You get up in the morning and there's a hug. Good morning. How did you sleep? You know, have a great day, that kind of thing. There have been times in the 32 years where I have had a dream where I wake up and my wife says, oh, good morning. And I'm like, don't you even come near me, right? I had a dream about you last night and I am not happy, right? Right? Now, if you ask me overall how satisfied am I with my marriage, is that going to influence my response?
No.
Yeah, it will. Trust me. If you knew my dreams. Yeah. So my point is that those are sources of error. Those are things that detract from our capacity to approximate truth, right? So I want to spend just a couple of minutes. What are some sources of error when we're asking people to fill out surveys or to make ratings on an observation, for instance?
Emotional status at the time of filling the survey.
So state of mind versus is it a stable trait? So our emotional presence at the time of filling out the survey. So that's one. It's called the state versus trait argument. Okay?
Like language barriers?
Language barriers, that's a great example, right? If English is not your first language, right, we tend to use a lot of idioms in our language, right? Pulling your chain, getting your goat, right? Those types of things that you're like, what are you talking about? You don't have a goat.
What may answer what they thinking?
Social desirability, and that is you ask. Well, I won't go there, but yeah, sometimes, you know, if I'm on the college campus in Norman, right, and it's the first second day of school on campus, and let's say that we have a very attractive individual who walks up and asks, to what extent are you interested in joining my ex, right? They may not have ever been interested, but now we've got an attractive person. That sort of influences the way we respond. So yes, that's one. How many of you have ever taken a timed test, right? And you've taken the timed test. Two things can happen. In the old days when we would take those by pencil and paper, like the GRE, the graduate record exam, you ever get off a bubble? Right, and it's timed. So now you've got to figure out where you're off and try to fix it, right? The other thing is let's say that you have 20 items left to respond to. You've got 5 minutes left, and you get rewarded for correct answers and not anything taken against for incorrect answers. So how do you answer those remaining items? You guess, right? All of those are sources of error and detract from our capacity to assess truth. So when we talk about reliability and validity, what we are really trying to understand is this aspect of our measures, okay? This aspect of our measures. Now, one of the things that happens a lot with me as a quantitative person who's pretty good at statistics is oftentimes people will come to me or approach me and ask me to analyze data that they've already collected, and they've created a survey or some sort of assessment, and they think they're measuring or attempting to measure a construct like stigma or trust in physicians might be one. And they use a single item, or they've got 4 or 5 individual items that they want to bring together, right? And what I want to highlight is that on the front end, when we're talking about these measurement issues, I need to really highlight the importance of theory, right? So if I'm a hope researcher, I study this idea of hope, right? So the first question you have to ask is, how do you define that? What do you mean by hope? And if people score high on hope, what does it even matter, right? And so this theoretical framework drives measurement, okay? So you need you need to be able to describe what it is you're measuring, okay? So the importance of theory. So with a construct, which is an abstract idea of something that's not directly observable, the first process that we have to go through is its definition. Have you ever heard the term, or somebody in a conversation use the word operationalization? How do you operationalize that?
No.
What they're getting at is, how do you define it, right? What's its meaning? And how do you actually quantify it? How do you measure it, right? And so once we have a definition, you might have heard the term operational definition, right? And we have a way to now ask people items to get them to respond to it. We've operationalized the construct, and it's now a variable. So that is the transition between construct to variable. A variable is any construct that can take on 2 or more values. Does that make sense? So we can now quantify it, okay? So as an example, what I want to use is this idea of commitment, right? So when you think about commitment, you know what I'm talking about. How loyal or how committed are you to something, right? So when I say the word commitment, what comes to your mind?
Engagement.
Engagement.
Dedication.
Sorry.
Dedication.
Dedication. Loyalty. Right. What I want to highlight is the way we begin to define constructs is with other constructs, right? And that is the real difficulty of our social sciences, right? Of this part of measuring, right? So we don't necessarily know what we mean by engagement. We don't necessarily know what we mean by dedication or loyalty without further operationalizing those terms. So if I define commitment as this, a psychological bond that an individual holds towards an object, right? And we'll stay with the fact that I've been married forever. And so we think about this idea of commitment. So relationship commitment, right? Or marital commitment, right? Which is my bond to, in this case, my wife, right? This bond that I have. Now, is that bond a cognition or an emotion?
Cognition.
Right. So it matters how we define that. So have you ever taken a survey and you've seen the words like I believe or considering everything? Those are cognitions, right? Have you ever seen items that say I feel? That's an emotion, and it matters, right? Because people will respond differently to the way that those words are introduced, because language introduces meaning for all of us, okay? So the next thing, because we think that it might be both a cognition or an emotion, let's talk about this idea of how many different types of bonds could exist, right? And so what I'm getting at is the dimensionality of a construct. So there's an emotional bond, right? When my wife is in pain and suffering, I'm in pain and I'm suffering, right? When my wife succeeds, I succeed, right? I have an emotional bond to her. Does that make sense? Right? By the way, affective commitment is from the framework of what we call social identity theory, right? That my definition of self is tied up into the things that I identify with, right? I am a fill in the blank, okay? That would be what I mean by your identity, okay? So another type of bond that I might have to my wife is what's referred to as normative commitment. And that is, I do things because I'm expected to. By the people who are important to me expect me to behave in a certain way, right? My two sons, I've been married for 30 plus years, my two sons expect me to be committed to my wife, right? Does that make sense? My wife's parents expect me to behave in a certain way towards my wife, okay? That's what I mean by normative, okay? The third and final dimension in this particular example is referred to as continuous commitment. And what I mean by that is, after being married for 30 plus years, I've invested so much into that relationship that starting over becomes harder. Does that make sense? Right? For instance, it's been a long time since I've dated, right? And I'm assuming that people don't dance today the way we danced 30 plus years ago, right? Or the appropriate types of activities that you do when you're dating is probably different, right? And what I mean by is it's going to require more energy to leave than it is to stay. Does that make sense? So what I've just done was I've just started the operationalization process of this construct of commitment. I've defined it. Okay, I've defined it. I've described its potential dimensions, right? And gave you some examples of those. Each of those dimensions have a theoretical framework that will help us explain behavior. Okay? So let me just introduce this. What is the best way to explain behavior?
Observation.
The best way to explain behavior is theory. Okay? Theory. The best way to test cause and effect relationships is research. It's experimental design. The best way to explain cause and effect relationships is theory. Okay? Research design tests theory. Okay? Does that make sense? So that's just really the groundwork of what I mean by a construct. And as we introduce this idea of constructs, define them, we next have to develop their measures. Now, when we're doing our own science, stigma, for instance, chances are we're not going to develop our own scale because there's a pretty good likelihood that those scales have been developed, right? However, the reason I wanted to go through this process is because those measures that we use, like hope or stigma or commitment, have already been through this process, right? Every time we conduct a study, we don't have to create our measurements from scratch. We can go out and find them, right? Which is what we're going to do deeper tomorrow, right? But what I want you to know is that those published measures, those existing measures, went through this process. Now, the article that was sent out, was it yesterday, Shelley? I sent 2 articles out to those people who had RSVP'd. If you didn't get those, can you visit with Shelley afterwards? We'll get you on the list, because we're really going to go through those tomorrow. Okay? And so the first article, which is by Snyder on the development and validation of the HOPE measure, went through that entire article, introduces the HOPE measure from this process. Okay? So I guess what I really want to underline here is you don't have to create your own measures. That's hard. For me, what I just had up here on the board, that was my dissertation. Okay? I developed a measure of commitment. Okay?
And so, going with that, what you just said, each time someone does research on commitment, are they testing theory?
They are. And that's the next part that we're going to now talk about reliability and validity. And how do you assess that, right? And so that's exactly right. They may be using my measure, if they're using commitment or whatever, to test those theoretical relationships, right? So just a real quick definition of reliability, right? You'll get a more formal definition if you get into any validity and reliability or measurement textbooks, but just to summarize it in a simple way, it's the consistency of scores obtained from a measure. How many times have you heard the word, that test is not reliable? Or that test is valid? It's a valid measure that we're using? Have you guys have all heard that? That's actually an incorrect use. Because tests are neither reliable or unreliable. Tests are neither valid or invalid. It's about the scores obtained from the test. Reliability is about the scores, right? Not about the test. Reliability and validity is sample specific. I could assess HOPE in this room and calculate the reliability, and then tomorrow with an entire new group of people assess it again, and I will get 2 statistical outcomes of reliability to some decimal point, okay? And so we should never just say, well, we're going to use HOPE because Snyder developed it in 1991 and he demonstrated its reliability. No, what he did was he demonstrated that the scores obtained from his sample in 1991 had good estimates of reliability. That may be different today. I study people within the nonprofit world, so Snyder studied at the University of Kansas among a bunch of intro to psychology students. Do you think reliability or validity and even the concept of HOPE is the same there as it is with homeless adults in Tulsa, Oklahoma? Right? 2 different types of samples, so we need to assess with every sample. Okay? In fact, both the APA and AMA require us to report these estimates, our estimates, right?
So when the measure is not correct, at that time the test is not valid. It's not that it is not reliable, right?
It's the scores obtained from the measure are not reliable. What we're going to get into next is this idea of validity, and if we don't have consistency among the scores, it's really a validity issue. That is, and I'll talk about it in just a second in more detail, validity is about the accuracy of your interpretation of a set of scores obtained from a measurement. Okay? That is, I'm going to ask you about your HOPE, have you fill out the scale. You're going to have a total score, and validity is about me interpreting that score as your HOPE. Okay? How valid is that interpretation? Okay? To say that you are hopeful or less hopeful, right, is a statement that we would make. The question is how much of that is truth? Okay?
But what about the measure? The researcher used a wrong measure.
So, well, it's just a misspecification of measures. Oftentimes, I think what you're getting at is we don't use the measures for its intended purposes.
Correct.
Right? And so, for instance, self-esteem. There are adult measures of self-esteem, right? If we take an adult measure of self-esteem and use it for a bunch of adolescents, we're using a scale that it was not intended for. So let's say this. Overall, I am a person of worth, right? That might be an item on a self-esteem scale. Sometimes I think I'm no good at all. Might be another item, right? Now, an adult, say in their 50s, is going to respond to that. Now, if I'm 15, I am a person of worth. Okay, maybe. Sometimes I feel no good at all. Yeah, right? Because that's just part of adolescence, right? So it's about the validity of the interpretation, right? Reliability, is the way we're talking about it, ranges from a value of a 0 to a 1, okay? There's formulas for it, but on Friday I'll actually show you, we'll analyze some data and I'll show you how simple it is. It's literally the click of a couple of buttons on how to assess it, okay? So it ranges from 0 to 1. The closer to 1, the less error in our measures. Okay, the closer to 1, the value of 1, the less error, or the more consistent our scores. Okay. So the question comes up within these constructs and these variables, how reliable is enough? What's good enough? Because what we know is that we can never measure anything perfectly. There's always some error, whether it's random or systematic. There's always going to be error. So what is good enough? So depending upon who you read, but this is a fairly traditional reference to Nunnally, that a 0.70 is acceptable, okay? The idea, if our observation is a function of true score plus error, what I'm getting at is my observation is 0.70 and I've got 30% error in my measures. Now, I could spend the rest of this week talking about why that matters, in that, for instance, if I look at the correlation between hope and well-being, and my measures are 0.70 in terms of reliability, meaning I've introduced 30% error, our formulas for correlation assume no error. And so what we have is a degraded observed correlation. That is, our correlation coefficient is lower than truth. Okay? Lower than truth. Okay? I'm not going to spend time going into those formulas. However, just know that if you measure something poorly, what you're going to do when you test those theoretical relationships is potentially say there's no effect. There's no relationship between hope and well-being in the sample, and it may be that it's because you have too much error in the way you measure it. You have a bad measure. It's not that hope and well-being are related, that's theory. Your methods are flawed. Your measures are flawed, okay? But when we conduct science, will only interpret the correlation, right? And again, I won't get into the type 1 versus type 2 errors in statistical assessments, but we'd be more likely to commit a type 2 error in that regard. I'm only going to talk about 2 types of reliability in here because they're going to be our most common used. I'm going to talk about internal consistency and test-retest. Okay? I'll talk about test-retest in just a few minutes. Now, internal consistency in the articles that we read or in the assessments that we conduct are referred to as either the Greek symbol alpha, the word alpha, or some version of Cronbach's alpha, named after Lee Cronbach, the person who developed the measure. And then, right? So today, the big takeaway is internal consistency. Know the definition, and that the way we assess it, one of the ways we assess it, is internal consistency. Okay? Because tomorrow I'm going to show you where to find that information. So let's say that I'm going to measure self-esteem. And I'm presented with this item. Overall, I am a person of worth. And then I'm given a Likert type response format, which is strongly disagree, disagree, agree, and strongly agree, right? So overall, I'm a person of worth. Okay. Right? Now, with a single item measure, does that equal truth? Right? What are types of things that might influence whether or not I believe I'm a person of worth? Okay.
Perception of worth.
Perception of worth. Maybe I received wonderful news today. Somebody really complimented me, or maybe more likely, somebody really hurt my feelings. Right? Somebody really called me into question who I am. Right? So state of mind versus trait, fatigue, a whole host of things can influence that. So how many times have you taken a survey and you're going through it and you say, okay, overall I'm a person of worth, and then a few minutes later you're like, I think I just answered that question, right? Mm-hmm. And then pretty quick you see it again, you're like, hey, wait a minute, right? And so you go back and you start to look, and you're like, yeah, they did it. It's a little different, but they asked that same question. What we're getting at is a way in which we can statistically assess internal consistency. That is, we have a scale, maybe multiple item measure, that is worded much the same way. And so the question with reliability of consistency is whether or not we respond to like items consistently. Okay? So in this first one, I say overall I'm a person of worth, and I circled the 3 for the agree. Now, if this is approximating truth, the way I responded, how should I respond to the second item? Sometimes I think I'm no good at all. 1 or 2. We've just established consistency, right? We've just established some level of reliability in that measure. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Internal consistency. Another form of reliability is test-retest. In test-retest, that is when we have stability or consistency of scores across time, right? Temporal stability. So the idea then is those things that might influence in the moment, that is somebody who said something quite negative to me, influence that. Well, if I measure it at another time, right, say 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks later, at some level I should get consistency, which tells me I'm measuring a trait, right? I'm measuring a characteristic, a stable characteristic of the individual. Now, I will tell you in science, when we do a study on stigma or hope, and we measure it one time, our assumptions when we write that up is that we've just measured a trait. That is, this is their level of hope. But we only measured it one time. We don't know what influenced their responses in that day, but we still treat it as a trait. And that is a limitation in science, right? We make the assumption of its stability, okay? Now, I'm going to kind of wrap up here pretty quickly, but reliability is a necessary but insufficient level of validity, okay? Necessary but insufficient. You have to have reliability in order to have validity, okay? That is, if you don't have a reliable set of scores, then there's no way for you to assess validity. You didn't measure what you thought you were measuring, okay? All right, does that make sense? I have the perfect example of this, okay? And I do have permission from my son to use this. When it happened to him, now I'm a measurement person, so I see the world through that lens. So when things happen to my family, I'm like, oh, validity, reliability, right? My youngest son, who's now approaching 30, when he was 12, he had a ruptured appendix. My youngest son has a really high pain tolerance. So we are actually out of town and he's complaining of a stomach ache, but he's playing with his cousins. And he's not laying down, he's literally up running around playing with his cousins, but he comes every once in a while and says, man, my stomach really hurts. So it's consistent enough that I call the hospital and say, here's the deal. And they're like, well, you know, we don't know, it could be this, but you'll have to come in. Is he sick? I'm like, no, he's playing basketball outside with it. And they're like, okay, just watch him if he gets a fever or something, right? Spend the night, we're coming back home, he's laying down. Get home, I actually come up here to work the next day and get a call from my wife. We're in the emergency room and my son just had a ruptured appendix. And oh, by the way, it ruptured 4 days ago, right? So he's got a lot of poison and stuff in his system 3 or 4 days ago, right? Because after we left there, he's like, it feels better, you know? But then he slowly starts to get feverish and sick. And so we go in and learn that, right? So just real quickly, goes through all of that, comes home. We're doing sort of some rehab, you know, stuff with him, walking a little bit. And probably about 10 days to a week, he starts to, we go out, we take him to his favorite restaurant, which was IHOP at the time, little plug for IHOP. And he won't eat. In fact, he's just laying his head down. And again, my son's got real high pain tolerance, right? He's broken ribs, he's had ACL torn, and broken arm, some other things. So anyway, we go back and sure enough, he's got a poison sac size of a baseball in him. So we go through that, right, again. And then about 10 days later, after we get home, we have a follow-up visit with our physician. And so we go in and he's going to have his, first thing they want to do is take his temperature. Now, I drop him off, it's raining, he jogs in easily, I go park, come in and sit down. We're in the doctor's office. And remember the thermometers that they'd stick under your tongue with the plastic deal, and it was fast? Right, not the one they do now,
Yes.
but that one. So we're sitting there, and it's 101.7.
Oh.
Now, I look over at him. He's getting nervous because he knows what's coming, right? Now, with a fever, what does that indicate?
There is an infection.
Now, does the fever mean there's an infection from that?
No.
Is it the only it's an indication, right? So we get the first test. So we wait a few minutes and people are starting to get kind of, right? My son's really nervous because he knows what's coming next, right? So if the fever is there, what's the next thing they're going to do? It's a little more intrusive. They're not just going to cut him open and say, nope, no infection.
Like blood test.
Right? So they're going to do the blood test, right? So it starts to get more and more invasive until they make a determine of validity, right? They need those indicators. So before we take his blood, and he knows that's what's coming, and he's 12, right? So he's a little nervous. A few minutes later, take the temperature, 101.7, and that was I saw the digital, it was 101.7 twice. What do we have?
Consistency.
We have reliability. So now people are moving, right? We're calling the lab. My son's getting nervous. I look over at him like, do you feel bad? And he's like, no, because I saw him just run in, but he also has high pain tolerance. So we're calling the lab, and I kid you not, we're all sitting in there, and a nurse walks by, stops, and says, oh, I hope you're not using this thermometer. It hasn't been working very well. Use this one, right? 98.6, 98.6, 98.6. Reliability is necessary, but not sufficient for validity. Have to have reliability in order to have validity. Okay? Isn't that a perfect example of that? That is the one thing you will never forget. I've been teaching research methods for about 20 years, and that's the only thing my students remember. Man, your son, how's he doing? Right? Validity is about the correct interpretation of scores. We're going to get into that more deeply in terms of actually looking at articles and calculating some things. But what I really wanted to do was start with a boring lecture about reliability so that you understand the term and what we mean by that and the whole process behind it, because when I show you how to find it in an article, it will simply be in a parentheses. in an article, one spot. Okay? Any final questions? We've got about 4 minutes. I think the more accurate use of it in measurement is construct, but a construct refers to the concept of. So I think it would be interchangeable. I think you could use it interchangeably. So when we get into this idea of validity, right, there are many different types of ways to assess validity. Content validity, criterion-related validity, which might be referred to as concurrent or divergent or convergent. There's many different subtypes. We're going to go over those tomorrow. And then this idea of construct validity. Construct validity is the very definition. That is, we have enough evidence from multiple studies, multiple researchers, under multiple contexts, that scores obtained from this measure can relate to a correct interpretation. So we might see, for instance, Beck's depression inventory, right? So the idea is you're going to get a score on that, and there's enough science behind it that somebody can interpret those scores. A clinician can now be trained to clinically interpret a score, right? And so that means that it's been triangulated enough, right? Triangulation is a term much more commonly used in qualitative methods, but what you're referring to is how much evidence needs to exist before we can actually, with confidence, say that. No single study equals truth. No single study equals truth. Just because I find something and I do all of this statistical manipulation and it's published in the top tier journal and gets article of the year in my entire profession, right, gets the highest accolades, right, does not mean it's actually true. It needs to be replicated. Okay? One study does not equal truth. First of all, what I want to say is how many of you have heard this term? It's not what you're asking, but I want to say it. How many of you have heard this idea that you can say anything with statistics?
Yeah.
And there's even a book, I think, Lies, Damn Lies, and Statistics. I want to, as a statistician, let me represent, right? And here's the idea: statistics don't lie. They don't. Statisticians lie. Right? And people doing a dissertation, for instance, people publishing, trying to get tenure and promotion, you've got to publish and all this stuff. There is a lot at stake in getting publications, right? And so you don't find anything, so where can I maybe retweak some things, right? Even though you've done science, you've discovered there's nothing there, right? So I think there's a lot of that. How many of you have heard the term meta-analysis? So the idea is that we go out and we do a study, that is, we collect every published study looking at the relationship between hope and well-being. And we can statistically analyze all of those published articles and say, this is what we know about that relationship, right? And, right? Get some sort of validity. However, the problem with a meta-analysis is, what if every study had the weakest design and didn't use a measure that had very high reliability? And so the idea that capturing a bunch of bad studies does not make a good outcome. So there's a whole host of things. I think this is part of the purpose of what Shelley's wanting to accomplish with these professional development deals, is just these conversations that we're going to start this week with kind of some statistical stuff, but we really ought to be talking about the scientific method and what do we mean by sampling and target population and generalizability, and where people have confidence in our findings. Great question. Anything else? Well, again, Shelley, thank you for coordinating this, and College of Arts and Sciences, and Alyssa for recording this and making this so. Plenty of food. I would avoid the Oreo chocolate things. All right, I'll take care of that for you. Anyway, please enjoy.
Thank you.